Are you wondering how you can learn more about food? Well, you're in the right place. This is the Chakula podcast, brought to you by the Root to Food Initiative, a show that celebrates authentic Kenyan dishes and serves you hot conversations about food in Kenya from an economic, social, and political lens. Sema nasi kwenye social media at Root to Food on Instagram, at Root to Food on Twitter, and Root to Food on Facebook. And now, here's your host, Felistas Mwalia.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Chakula podcast. I'm your host, Felistas Mwalia. Karibuni sana. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing it out. Today, we are having yet another interesting conversation, still around the food you eat. We are joined by Oyunga Pala, who is the curator-in-chief of the Elephant. Karibu sana, Oyunga.
Thank you so much, Feli.
How are you coping with COVID? How are things in Amsterdam?
COVID has been kind. Fortunately, there's nobody around my immediate family who has been affected. I've had a lot of other people who have suffered quite serious tragedies. It's kept us all locked in.
Yeah.
But we're grateful. There's been no drama. Amsterdam is good. It's just we're just going into autumn. So it's Dutch wind and rain, which is terrible weather, I tell you. Terrible. Yeah.
It's actually quite similar here. It's too cold.
Yeah, but you guys know in 1 week it will be over. Us, we're stuck like this for the next 3 months.
Ooh. Thanks for making time for this interesting discussion. You are one person who is passionate about indigenous food and traditional farming methods. And I think majority of Kenyans out here are starting to ask themselves about the disappearance of managu, how managu is very expensive nowadays. But for you, Oyunga, tell us how it all began.
Well, I grew up in Nairobi, but my parents had, I used to say, like 1 foot family planted in the village, where they came from, the ancestral home.
Yeah.
This is out in Sarah County, a place called Gaming. So my grandmother was an active farmer. So throughout my life, we had a tradition of, at least through my schooling years, we'd go back every school holidays. And it sort of always coincided with some farming activity. As I grew up, I learned to be sort of, you start off as being part of the labor.
Yeah.
Someone who's just helping around. Then after a while, you learn the processes. And it's much later in life when I start to encounter other modern systems that I start to realize the value of what my grandmother was doing, how smart her farming was. So that's sort of what became the genesis of this sort of going back to the core, to going back to what I used to see my grandmother do. Because I started encountering these principles in all this sort of new sort of conscious movements around agriculture.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized, why does this sound so familiar? And when I sort of started to interrogate and go back and investigate, I said, this is exactly what we call a Dana. This is exactly what Dana used to do. Yeah.
You mentioned how closely your family was connected to the rural lands and how that shaped social and food relations. What was that like?
What was it like to be connected?
Yeah.
I think it's just that, I think as Africans, at least most of us, you have what we call the ancestral land, which of course could be a disputed term because at some point it does get acquired, depending on what the movements of your people are. But it's where it's sort of like it's a piece of land that has been there since my great grandfather, right? So it's been in the family for over 100 years. Huh?
Yeah.
And when you think about it, of course, it's gotten subdivided, but it becomes something that we're very rooted in because it's our graves are there. It's a piece of land that has brought up generations. Huh?
Yeah.
So there's a very close connection, and partly why it becomes really important. There's 2 things. One is that the land in itself was just habitation, but then also the land that feeds us. It's a production unit. So over the years, we've just learned to exploit it really well.
Yeah.
But as the years, as we're coming into sort of this era of modernity, as the land starts to get smaller, there's more pressure, housing is taking more land, suddenly we're realizing agriculture is not efficient. And if we continue in this way, this model that we're doing, those who come after us will really have no soils. They'll literally have dead land. You'd have a piece of land, but it's not productive at all. So then this is what has forced us to really, really examine, because now we are the custodians of this generation, passing it on to the next. So whatever it is that we do now will determine what our children inherit. So this is then what forces us to say, hey, let's revisit our connections to this piece of land and say, what are we doing as its custodians? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Oyunga. Maybe I can ask another question.
Yes.
Not necessarily linking it to your family, how your family was connected to the rural lands, but at what point do we begin to see the influence of capital in what we choose to farm and eat and what we plant in our urban gardens?
I think for us, it really goes back right to the encounter, at least for my family specifically, if I'd be very specific. It goes back to the encounter with colonization. Yeah. So in the story, I make the distinction between how my grandfather was farming and how my grandmother was farming. There's a clear distinction. So my grandfather then acquires the big portions of land. It's not too much, not very big a piece, about just 3 to 4 acres, and they're scattered. It's not all in one spot. So then my grandfather gets into 2 cash crops all the time. One becomes coffee, because there was coffee in Nyanza in the 50s and 60s. And then he gets into white maize. So white maize then becomes the maize that we now eat here, that's become sort of the norm. Yeah. Back then we had millet and sorghum. Those were our grains, our cereals. So white maize became a commercial product, and it was commercial also because of the way it was grown. It was monocropped. So you grow it, and you grow it in straight lines, and you had to bring out a rope so that they all appeared in lines. So everybody was trying to mimic what then were European farms, right?
Yeah.
And so that becomes our first encounter. And so what the separation is that my grandfather is planting his white maize and his coffee bushes. He's got a couple of coffee bushes. And that industry dies because the processing is taken to the other side of the country, and there's no support at least in Nyanza. But the maize continues. But my grandmother has her little sort of what you'd call a back garden behind the kitchen, like a kitchen garden. And in it, because you spend time there all the time as children, practically every evening before dinner, as you're helping around the kitchen, and you've always been sent to the garden. And that's when you realize, now in hindsight, the garden had everything. It had fruits, it had cereals, it had grains, it had tubers, it had herbs and spices. It had literally everything, and it almost looked unruly. It wasn't kempt.
Yeah.
But now that I know better, it's a very sophisticated permaculture system. Yet, on my grandfather's fields, where he was growing the maize, he was forced then later when they started doing intercropping. So they would introduce, for example,
Oyunga,
beans.
Maybe I can interject and take you back. Talking about permaculture, is it similar to organic farming? Does it mean your grandma didn't use any pesticides? Basically, for a normal person who has never heard of the term before, what will you say permaculture involves?
I wouldn't call it organic, because organic just basically, sometimes I find the term a bit problematic.
Yeah.
But permaculture basically is a short for permanent agriculture, right? Which means you're farming on a piece of land continuously, but you're doing it in a way that's actually harmonious, right? So it's very minimal cultivation. The plants are sort of like interdependent, right?
Yeah.
And so permaculture operates almost as a system. So everything has to have a system. The same plants that sort of wilt from there become manure for the others. So everything is integrated, and it's never monocropped. It's full of diversity, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm seeing my grandmother doing. She's doing it at a smaller scale, but her garden literally is productive throughout the year. So then that creates a distinction. For the longest time, of course, we stick with the monocropping, which becomes sort of the ideal of agriculture, until through our own experiences, we start to see its limitations. Yeah.
Okay. So from the previous questions, you've talked about your grandmother and how every plant in your grandmother's garden had a function. Was it for utility value, a safeguard against inefficiency, or was it just prudent survival mechanism at a point where they didn't have the luxury to experiment with planting everything?
I think you could say it's a combination of all of what you just said.
Yeah.
I would say all of the above.
Yeah.
One is, and I think there's a core of it, which then becomes, I think, the genius of what they're doing. One is just they're dealing with the realities of their environment, right? So if for a simple thing, like for example, my grandmother always had cassava, right?
Oh, yeah.
And cassava was always a backup food in times of drought, because cassava would survive any sort of extreme weather situation. And that means we had an alternative starch all the time, right? So things like cassava. My grandmother, for example, had fruit. For example, she'd have a pawpaw, but a self-perpetuating pawpaw tree that always seemed to be fruiting. So there's the food security element of it, right? there was certain vegetables and certain herbs help sort of nitrogen fix the soil. So all of the greens she used to use would be very useful. For example, she'd have a lot of pumpkin leaves. Pumpkin, and the leaves would be perfect sort of fertilizers for other plants. Then she had like peppers, certain pili-pilis, which were perfect sort of insecticide, pesticides against others. Everything had a use. There was even lemongrass, which, as you know, has citronella, which is a mosquito repellent. So in areas where we have malaria, like where we come from, so everything had a function within itself, and that's why she was farming as a system and literally as a backup in case my grandfather's commercial venture, which is supposed to bring the money, failed, because some seasons they would fail.
Wow, interesting. From this whole conversation, Kenya is still food insecure. People are still struggling to access food. What food system lesson can Kenya learn from, especially during this period, during the COVID period?
I mean, we're at a difficult time as a country. I mean, and you can't divorce it from our colonial past, the kind of systems we inherited, and then what happened to our own systems of knowledge, because our systems of knowledge were very systematically destroyed. I think the onus is on a lot of us, especially us as a generation. When I say us, I mean this generation. People at least under 50, to at least take on some responsibility to sort of like interrogate their decisions, especially if you have some sense of urgency and there's a piece of land somewhere that you can actually decide what's going to happen to it. It takes some urgency, because at the core of it, and this is the point I forgot to mention, is what my grandmother understood fundamentally, which is that you have to own your seed. You can't call yourself a farmer if you don't own seed. Right now, our seed is completely commercialized, and we have the kind of seed that can't even survive without fertilizer and a whole range of other additives that have to go to make this plant grow. My grandmother kept all her seed, So a lot of that seed disappeared. I mean, I was smart enough to at least keep with the lemongrass seed, the original lemongrass that she used to have. But by the time I was coming to that realization, most of the crops that she had there disappeared because nobody bothered to retain the seed. So I think at the core of it is that if we retain the seed, because the seed comes from a generation of experience. There's a reason why something has survived that long. It has been passed on from generation to generation. And we're the first generation that turned their back on our seed. And what is happening now is commercial, big agricultural entities have basically colonized our seed. So they control everything, to the point now in places like my village, you find that there are people now who can't grow. They have land, but they simply can't grow because they can't afford seed. Or if they afford seed, they can't afford fertilizer. So, it's a catch-22 situation. So there you have the resource, the land, but you can't afford to cultivate it because you have no seed. For true food sovereignty to happen, the first thing people have to do is that they have to take control back of their seed. Once they take control back of their seeds, then we start to build back lost knowledge systems and basically innovate new ways based on our realities. This thing of trying to farm like Europeans, like the Dutch do, is not going to do us too good. It works to a certain degree with certain large-scale operations, that can work because it requires a lot of mechanization. But for small-scale indigenous farms, we have to think of alternative systems. Because even soil gets exhausted. If you abuse it, it will get exhausted.
Wow. I also think the main problem here is many people link food insecurity to a production problem.
But you see, the thing is that it came out very well in this food series that was curated, that 25% of agricultural production in Kenya come from small-scale farmers. Now, small-scale farmers are characters like me, dabbling around in some 2-3 acre piece of land. Right? Now, if we have some clarity about what our role is in terms of food security in a country, then we're able to make decisions that make our food systems more sustainable. Right now, I think we are very, very, very fragile. And COVID has tested us in real ways.
How do we even begin to bring back access and preservation of our seed culture? Is there hope?
I think not necessarily from scratch. I like to say that our grandmothers are still alive. So let's go back to our real professors. When we talk about professors of agriculture, I'm talking to my grandmother who's been farming continuously for the last 70 years. And this is one of my other grandmothers. My real maternal grandmother passed on a long time ago. But as you know, as Africans, we have grandmothers. We don't love for grandmothers. I like to say grandmothers, not that grandfathers don't farm, but grandmothers are the keepers of the knowledge. So we just need to go back to those people. and observe them and ask them, and sit at their feet. Because this generation is going to die out in the next 10 years. This sort of almost pre-colonial generation, the people who were alive when the white man was coming to these lands,
Yeah.
They're about to die. The last of them is about to die. And this knowledge is going to disappear. So what we need to do is, at least, especially those of us who are in positions of agency, is to write about it, to tell the stories and to share this knowledge. But ultimately, we need to reconstruct new knowledge systems around agriculture to really interrogate. Kenya is a space that has a lot of expertise, but we've got to challenge some of the systems that we've held as normal, so that we actually then create alternative systems that work for us. Because right now we have an agricultural model that's completely aspirational.
Yeah.
But this is why then you have greenhouses and all this agricultural scams coming up, because everybody's looking at agriculture as a quick money fix. Put up a greenhouse and become a millionaire in 2 years, selling tomatoes and onions. We've got to change that attitude. Yeah.
And the crazy thing is that our population grows by 1 million a year. So how do you anticipate that will look like in 30 years when the population hits 100 million?
Well, two things. It could be total anarchy, or we could just be the generation that chooses the path of enlightenment, which is why then we go back. And when I say the generation, because there are individual choices. Yes, of course, there's the whole policy level, the stuff that only big government can do. But it's only an awake population that drives governments towards certain places, right? If you have a population that's asleep, nothing's going to happen at the top, right? So it starts with a whole basic bunch of concerted, conscious individuals making certain choices in their little small pockets. And they're the ones who become now the spheres of influence that then affect communities. And these communities then put pressures on their leaders and their systems of governance to basically bring about fundamental change that basically benefits the people. So as opposed to looking at it as a crisis in the waiting, I look at it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
How do we organize ourselves in ways that basically we make ourselves food secure in the future? How do we organize ourselves that our knowledge systems are not only rediscovered, but retained so they can be passed on? And how do we get back agency in terms of things that are most important, such as things like our seeds? Get back seed sovereignty, because seed sovereignty is the key to food sovereignty.
Thank you so much. In closing, I have witnessed a lot of people talking about permaculture, kitchen gardening. Do you think this is a path to self-sustenance? And what advice do you have for anyone starting out in that direction?
I'll tell them, I guess sustenance is important. I think the whole principle of permaculture, which sometimes I laugh at because I'm saying this is just Dana. It's funny, when it's packaged from the West, suddenly it becomes really beautiful. But it's what we've always known. The idea about agriculture was like a skill set that everybody had. Right? Mm-hmm. In the same way, I don't know, if you grew up in a pastoral community, nobody goes to a herding school. It is something you grow up knowing. If you grow up in a farm in Europe, you'll always be able to drive a tractor. You don't have to go to a driving school for tractors. Right? Mm-hmm. So, we've got to sort of approach food as just a skill, the ability to produce food. So we should have basically as a skill set, like a profession. There's a whole bunch of people who know how to grow food. It should be something that's normalized. We should stop living it as something that's only to the specialists. We go back to how we always used to do it. Because my parents had professional jobs, but they were farmers. So we go back into the idea that everybody should understand the connection between them and the land and what they can do in terms of food production. Right?
Yeah.
Do people understand that? I know you're calling it kitchen gardening.
Yeah.
But gardening basically means potting around, and it's a fancy term. But basically, I just call it farming. As long as people can understand that it doesn't matter whether you're farming on, 100 acres or a quarter acre or an eighth of an acre. Farming is farming, right?
Yeah.
The same principles that apply. So the ability to be able to continuously produce food on a single piece of resource, of soil, of land, is the skill that we have to develop deeply. And what's connected is understanding the connection between the soil, the seed, and then the inputs, and then the cycle. Because once we get that balance correct and we know it at an individual level, then farming becomes sustainable. So, because that's at the core, because even at the food production core, we're not producing food for ourselves. We're producing food for almost an export market, an overseas market. So we have to go back in the sense of like, okay, as an individual, how do I learn? How do I farm correctly?
Wow. We've talked about Chakula Magazine, about your grandma's farm, and the good pieces written in there. Which other spaces do you think Kenyans can talk about food, and how can they begin taking the power back?
I think what you guys are doing becomes good is because, first of all, you just need to inform people, because sometimes we get hard on ourselves, but we just didn't have the information. So I think the important thing is that I think those of us who have opportunities to do this, to continue to inform people, all through, and then to understand food, and which I think this is something that Chakula has done really well, to understand food as a system. And you can be different sides of the system, even as a consumer, you have a lot of agency by deciding what you want to eat. If you're the kind of person who's going to insist on having eggs from Dubai, you only eat imported food, and you're basically killing your own farmers. You only eat, I want beef from New Zealand. This whole colonial mentality problem that we sometimes suffer as Africans. So if even at the consumer level, we have that level of awareness that said there's a direct connection between what I buy and how it benefits an entire system of farmers at the bottom of the pyramid, that makes a big difference. So I think everybody has agency. They just have to realize that there's a connection. The reason why the West, for example, suffers is because people have lost connection to their food, which is why somebody can be buying poison and they have no idea. So we have to go back into understanding that what is the source of my food? The moment we understand the source of my food, then we understand that we're part of an integral system and each one of us has a play.
Thank you so much, Oyunga. We've now come to an end of our conversation. But before we say bye to the people, a word from your grandma Dana to carry us throughout the week.
That's the one I should have thought about. It's punchy and nice. I think it's just something my grandmother, she didn't say, but I think she would have said. Is that, I think the phrase I start with is, they thought they had buried us, but they forgot that we were seeds, right? So the idea is that basically our grandmothers and those who came before us have already implanted the seeds within us.
Can I take you back? You said they thought we had died, or what did you say?
They thought they had buried us.
Oh.
Yeah. Or rather, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. I mean, so it becomes and this is a quote from a Greek poet. So we might have lost our way a little bit, and we sort of forgot that we have this knowledge. So I think we need to go back and realize that this knowledge is there. It's like a seed that's just waiting to be nurtured. We just have to go back and gather it. We literally have to go back to where we left them behind, where we lost our way, and find ourselves afresh. When you lose your way on a journey, what do? You go back to the point where you lost your way. Right? I think the point where we lost our way is when we stopped paying attention to what our grandmothers were doing. So if we go back there and start afresh and then develop systems from what they were seeing, because we're talking about hundreds of years of observation that we just dismissed for another. So we need to go back and relearn again, We just go back and learn afresh, And so like seeds, let's go back and gather the seeds that we despise. Let's go back and pick them up and replant them afresh.
Asante Oyunga for your insights, and thank you good people for tuning in. We'll be coming to you every Friday. Please subscribe to our SoundCloud and iTunes accounts. Also on social media, at Root to Food on Twitter, at Root to Food on Facebook, at Root to Food on Instagram, and at Root to Food on YouTube. If you have any questions, views, opinions, or objections, please share them on info@roottofood.org. See you next week. Stay safe. Thank you.